Yeah,
There
so
we go.
let's get started. Welcome, everyone, and please do ask questions if you have them, and we'll get to them at the end. I'll definitely leave some time for that. Um, I always think that it's useful to think about what qualitative data actually is before we get started with thinking about what to do with it. So, what is the nature of the qualitative enterprise? Just to take a step back and think about what it is that we're trying to do and why we have qualitative data. What are we trying to get? So I just wanted to take a little step back first and think about that. If we think about the difference between, say, qualitative and quantitative data, what is the difference? Because sometimes I think too much is made of that difference. We, both of us, quantitative and qualitative, use a science system to represent something about the world, right? So if you think about it, if say we do a little survey after our webinar and we ask out of 5, what was your experience of the webinar? And we will come up with a number which will be used to represent something about reality, to represent our experience here in the webinar this evening. Now, in qualitative data, we actually also use a science system to represent something about reality. The science system that we use in this case is words, right? Because words are a representation of something about reality. If you interview someone, you're not getting their experience. What you're getting is a representation of their experience using a symbol system, which is called language, right? So we're working then in both of these traditions with a way of trying to represent something about reality. Now, in qualitative work, the difference, one of the big differences with quantitative work, is that whereas in quantitative research, we are essentially simplifying reality. If you think about the whole messy experience of being in this webinar, there's lots of stuff going down. There's your expectations, my expectations, things going on in your life, things going on in my life, things going on in the room with you, your space, all kinds of stuff. It's a very big, messy experience. And if we did our little survey, we would reduce all of that to a number. 95% loved the webinar. So that's one of the features of quantitative work, is that it tries to reduce that complexity. And that's really useful. It could be useful for Jessica to know that for whatever reason, we don't know why, but there was great approval for this webinar and people had a good experience with the dissertation coach. But in qualitative work, we do something quite different, right? We are staying with the messiness, we're staying with the complexity, we're trying not to reduce it. So we're trying to get insight into that messiness of all the reasons why we might have experienced, say, the webinar or eating an apple, whatever the case is, whatever human experience you're trying to represent. And so I think it's useful to always think about it in that way, is to realize that with your interview transcripts or whatever other qualitative data you might have, what you have is a representation of someone's experience using a symbol system, which is language. And so you're trying to find a way of, how do I deal with those symbols, with that representation of someone's reality? And important to this enterprise is the fact that if you think about it, if you just take a minute to think about it, if I ask you, what is your experience, say, of parenting or something like that, can you really ever render that experience to me? Can you ever really give me what is your experience of parenting or of being parented? If you really think about it, it's really, really difficult to get at human experience. And so that's why we say when we work with qualitative data, we're working with data in a very provisional, hesitant kind of way, because we're very, very humbly accepting of how difficult it is to render human experience in a kind of real and authentic way. There's no way really of representing what of kind of having a representative sample of what eating an apple feels like to human beings. And that's really hard for people to come to terms with, because people want representative samples. They want to know, have you represented the people? And we want to know that you've represented all of the apple eaters. But it's a nonsense, really, because there's no way to representatively come across apple eaters, because what are you going to represent? Are you going to represent eye color and apple eating, or education levels and apple eating? It's just too vast and diverse. And so it's the wrong way of thinking about it. So in our qualitative data, remember that we're not representing people, we're representing phenomena. So we're representing the experience of a particular phenomenon. Say, for example, if my project was parenting an autistic child, then you're not representing me as a white middle-aged woman parenting an autistic child. You're representing the experience, one person's experience, in order to get closer and closer to having insight into that particular phenomenon. And there would be no final answer. There would be no final answer of what that experience is like. There would only be interpretation. And that interpretation is always going to be provisional. So when you work with your qualitative data, it may be freeing, but it may also be terrifying to realize that there's not an interpretation. Your job with the data is not to find the interpretation. Your job with the data is to come to an appreciation and to come to insight into the phenomenon. And the insight, we always realize, will be kind of partial and provisional. And our processes need to be geared towards gathering those rich and detailed and interesting insights, whilst always knowing that they will be provisional. And so those insights need to be systematic. They need to be rooted in the data. We don't just make up our insights, but at the same time, we are always very, very aware of how difficult it is to truly represent human experience, because of the nature of the human subject, right? Humans are not like potatoes in a laboratory that always behave the same way. If you put iodine on a potato, it is always going to turn purple, because that's what iodine does in the presence of starch. But human beings in one interview encounter will behave differently to how they will in another one. And they'll behave differently today to how they would tomorrow, because we are conscious and we're capable of learning and we're capable of reflection, and we think differently about our experiences every minute of the day. And so it's kind of humbling to think about this enterprise, because we really want to do it. We really want to understand something about human experience, but we also really are aware of how difficult it is. Okay, so I wanted to situate ourselves before I started. Okay, so I don't know if you know anything about me, but so I got I read for my PhD at Oxford many years ago, and ever since then I've really been working in universities and working in the last 10 to 15 years very much with PhD candidates in many different parts of the world. And it's my great pleasure to help people when they are embarking on PhD journeys or on thesis journeys, research journeys, because it is such an exciting thing to do, but also very often quite a daunting thing to do. So you're more than welcome to ask more about me and the kinds of things that I do later. But yeah, I'll leave that at that. So we did put it out in our blurb what it is that we hope to achieve with this webinar this evening. And I'm going to talk about coding and various coding strategies, and really try and talk in quite a practical way about exactly how we would go about coding. I think there's nothing more terrifying than having a qualitative data set in front of you and really not knowing what to do with it. And in my experience, it's quite normal to come with all your interviews and think, oh, my hat, I don't have anything. I don't know what I'm going to say. There's nothing here. And so what I think these coding processes are aimed at is getting the data to reveal itself to us, right? So there is meaning there, but you can't expect it just to emerge. It's not magic. There's a process of labor involved. And sometimes I think that people's sort of labor process that they engage in with the data is a bit weird, and it's not systematic, and it's sort of very impressionistic. It's just, oh, well, this paragraph means that, and I'll just assign a word to that page, and here's another paragraph, I'll put a word there, and so I'm coding. And I think you'll always have to remember my sort of opening words, which is that we're trying to get at this really difficult, complicated, messy thing, which is this rendition of human experience. So our processes have to be quite systematic, quite detailed, quite careful, if we expect the data to reveal itself to us. Now, with that said, remember that there's not one way of dealing with qualitative data, because there isn't one qualitative research design. Of course, there's many possible research designs. We could be doing phenomenology, and there's phenomenological ways of coding and ways of working with data, detailed procedures that people use. We could be using a Feynmanian approach with the 6 research steps. We could be doing a narrative study, in which case we would code maybe using dramaturgical coding devices, using narrative devices. So what I'm going to talk about today are the sort of very basic ones, which we might see ourselves using in almost any project. Just being alert to those, regardless of your qualitative design, I find can often help. Okay, so let's move along. What is our aim when we are coding? So I've talked about wanting the data to reveal itself to us, right? To be able to come up with a theorization, an explanation, insight into our data, to think about what kinds of patterns are we finding in the data. These patterns are sometimes called themes, but that's not a word that is used in every design necessarily. Not every way of working with qualitative data is thematic analysis. So we're looking for these repeating ideas in the data which require some sort of explanation and interpretation from us. And that explanation and interpretation is going to be on the basis of ideas drawn from literature within our discipline. One of the, I don't know if I say this later, but I'm just going to say it now anyway, because I think it's so important. Whenever I work with people's interpretations of their qualitative data, one of the mistakes that I always see is that you'll get a quote, and then the writer will say what is in the quote in slightly different words. Now, that's not analysis. I mean, your reader is not an idiot, right? Your reader can read what is in the quote and understand it for themselves. So surely your job as the analyst, as the interpreter, cannot be to just tell me in your own words what is in the quote. That cannot be what we mean by analysis. And certainly, I don't want to give a PhD to somebody who just told me what the people said in slightly different words, right? That cannot be what we mean by interpretation and analysis. So what is interpretation and analysis? And one of the things that we need to realize then is that these coding processes that I'm going to talk about are processes towards interpretation. They're the scaffolding that gives you the insight, that begins to give you a story that you can tell about your data. But that story needs to be rooted not only in the data, but also in the scholarly literature, right? So it's not just you saying, oh, well, I think this person's having a bad day or whatever. It's you drawing on the appropriate literature within your discipline to now come to explain to your reader and provide your reader with deeper insight using concepts drawn from your theoretical framing of the project. Okay, so coding is a step towards analysis. It is not analysis itself. All right. Let's talk about exactly what a code is. I think a good definition is that it is a short, essence-capturing phrase. Now, one of the things I want to warn against is using a single word as a code. So what we are looking for is a meaningful way of summarizing a larger piece of data, a larger chunk. A larger chunk could be a sentence, it could be a line, it could be a paragraph. But that we need to see coding as trying to meaningfully represent what is in that chunk of data, rather than just a word like sad, cross, happy, whatever. That's not really meaningful. So try and force yourself to use a phrase. You can think about a code as a little summary, and remember that it's an interpretive act. So don't be scared to sort of launch in and just start doing the interpretation. And I've said that it is a transition between interpretation and analysis. You might come up in your reading with some of these terms. So I've just put them there on the presentation, which will be available to you. But we talk about holistic coding when we try and get a sort of overall impression. It might be an overall impression of an entire interview or of a chunk of text or of a page. We talk about provisional codes as that sort of start list where we're starting to think about these might be the codes, these might be things that we would want to elevate to themes. And then when people talk about hypothesis coding, which might sound quite out of place in a qualitative project, but they use the term loosely, right? Which is to test a sort of hunch or prediction that you've got going on about what kind of story you think might be working for your data. Okay, so if that's what a code is, then what is coding? Very often we would have things printed out like this, and we would assign codes to our data, assign these interpretive phrases to our data. Now, you can code any kind of text. You could code your interview transcripts, your focus group transcripts, could be debates from government committees, it could be newspaper articles, letters, diaries, whatever the case might be. And when we think about coding, confusingly, we think about 3 cycles, but the first cycle is not coding. The first cycle, or first stage of coding is pre-coding, okay? And then we talk about first cycle coding methods and second cycle coding methods. So in pre-coding, we're simply trying to recognize what might be important. We're simply familiarizing ourselves with the data. First cycle coding is really where the heart of what I want to talk about lies, is to talk about some methods that we could use to work with the data and start to fracture it into our coded elements. And then in second cycle coding, we put the data away and we start to work only with the codes, right? So we start to organize those codes and to think about how they might fit together to begin to tell a story. Now, there are different ways of coding. This evening, or it's evening where I am, I'm going to talk about data-driven coding, right? So coding that starts from the data. But notice that not everybody does it like that. Some people would start with the categories derived from theory or literature, which is called deductive coding or theory-driven coding. And then very often we would use a hybrid or mix of the two. But for qualitative work, I always advocate that people start with the data. Try to be true to the data, because that is essentially what our mission is about, which is to stay close to our participants, give voice to our participants, and stay close to what their meaning before we begin to impose meaning on what we are hearing. Okay. Just a note on memos and coding. So memos are these little ways of writing, recording your thoughts as you code. And I think it's really useful and really important to get into the discipline of memo writing, because Robert Stake says that, or Clark, I think it was, that said, memos are sites of conversation with yourself about the data. So I think that's a really useful way of thinking about it, to record your thoughts and to begin to have a conversation with yourself about what is going on in the data, and to be quite creative, to be unencumbered by, having to be grammatical or put your punctuation or anything. You can just record your thoughts in quite a raw way. And if you keep doing this as you go along, you'll find that your voice emerges much more strongly in the interpretation. Now, here's some advice on memos. Don't think that you have to wait until something is memo worthy. This is a personal recording. You can record your wildest ideas, your inspiration, anything that occurs to you that you think, wow, I wonder, maybe this is what's going on there. That's absolutely fine. So try and record vivid memories that can spark your imagination as you go to interpretation later. Okay, so to get into it then, data-driven coding, step one I said would be the pre-coding. I always like to have all my highlighters, my sticky notes, different color pens, and that kind of thing in order to do the coding. You might say to me, well, do I really have to print out the coding? Can't I code on screen? Can't I just use a program like in Vivo to code my data for me? My advice is to touch the data, to get your hands dirty. So the way that I like to work with data is to have everything double line spaced and to have a wide right-hand margin. Now, you could do that on the screen. That's perfectly fine. But if you have a smallish data set, it's also very nice to just print it out like that, double line spaced with a wide right-hand margin so that you can write your codes. And there's something about being able to see the printed pages and to see your sticky notes and to be able to move your sticky notes physically around from one page to another and to say to yourself, I think it doesn't actually go there, maybe it goes there, and I want to move stuff around. So when we talk about pre-coding, which is step one, where you familiarize yourself with the data, it's just about taking a highlighter and just going through the whole data set, right? Because you might have done one interview in month one and another interview a couple of weeks later, and then you put the interviews away and you went off and did something else. So you might have a bit of a fragmented idea about your data. And so it's really useful to sit down in one shot and go through the entire data set with the highlighter and to just highlight anything that seems important or interesting. You're not coding right now, it's pre-coding, it's before coding. Remember to write your memos as you go along. Start that memo book. Start recording your thoughts. So you're just getting to know the data, noting items of interest, and you want to read actively and analytically, right? You're not just reading in a passive way. So constantly be asking yourself, how does this interact with my research concern? How does this answer my research question? How does it relate to the theory that I'm using? Why am I interested in this? Okay, so that's the first step. And your memo writing, you're going to say, why did I find it interesting? What was interesting about it? And so on and so forth. Now, after pre-coding, you can get into your first cycle coding methods. Now, why do I have a picture of a washing machine here? So the way I think about first cycle coding methods is, if you've got quite a fancy washing machine, if your data is the dirty washing, the dirty clothes, and your different cycles of coding are cycles on the washing machine. If you think about it, if you want to put your dirty clothes into the washing machine and you want the washing machine to do a good job and come out with nice, clean, dry clothes at the end, you can't expect it to do all the cycles at once. Your washing machine can't soak out the stains and rinse and put the softener and clean and dry all at once. The way a washing machine works is it goes through one cycle at a time. And that's the way with first cycle coding methods. There's many different methods that we can use, but take it through one cycle at a time in order to really try to wring the data of meaning, right? At the end of the day, what you're trying to do is to get a much clearer picture of what is going on with your data at the end, and to be able to render that to your reader. So what are some of these first cycle coding methods? The first cycle that I think you should use, that you should start with, is what is called in vivo coding. Now, in vivo is nothing to do with the software program. The software program got its name from the way of coding. So in vivo, and to do this, I've just come up with a research question. How do employees experience the disruption of spatial and temporal routines associated with remote working? And how do they seek to restore a sense of order and continuity in their working lives? So we've got a data set. We've got 5 interview excerpts, and we can just pretend that we're working with that data set for the sake of demonstration. Okay, so if we took our first participant, this is Sipho, the IT project lead, and we read this little quote from Sipho, we could code it in vivo. Now, what does in vivo mean? It means that we're going to take words from the original transcript and we're going to use those as our codes instead of coming up with codes of our own. So in vivo just means in the words of. So we could say flexibility. We could say the job expands to fill everything. So that would be how we would do in vivo coding. We would go through all of your transcripts or all of your textual data, whatever it might be, and you would highlight in a different color from your pre-coding so that you can distinguish it, highlight any words that you think could actually act as codes for the data, but they are called in vivo because they happen to be in the original words of the participant. Okay, so if you look at this, I'm sure you can probably see other words here that might be able to act as in vivo codes. I can think of you're available in a different way, physically out of sight, and so on. So, of course, you could also take that same segment and you could quote it not in vivo. You could say not having to commute, more time with family. We could come up with short essence capturing words or phrases, or little summaries, meaningful summaries of chunks of data. So Philip Adu says that qualitative data analysis is about data reduction. So you can see that even although I've got quite a lot on the right-hand side here, I've still reduced this whole segment to something less than what it was originally without losing any of the original meaning. Okay, so that was the first cycle of our washing machine. Take all of your data and code it in vivo. Let's go on to some other cycles, right? Another cycle that you could use is what is called attribute coding, which is to just go through your data set and make sure that you give it attributes. So these should be attributes that are meaningful within the context of your particular research project, right? So not age and gender and so on is not necessarily relevant to every research project, but in some it might be. In some it might be, well, the attribute is that this was a rural school and this was a more urban school, or the attribute might be that this was a middle school and this was a high school, or whatever the case might be. This was somebody that had a higher degree and this was somebody that didn't finish school. Whatever attributes you want to associate with those transcripts. And the reason why you might do this is because later on you might want to go and say to yourself, well, I wonder if there was something similar, or if there was a pattern among the rural schools that I wasn't seeing among the urban schools, or whatever the case might be. So I'm not going to demonstrate that, but it is something that you can do with your data. Okay. The next cycle of the washing machine that I want to look at is what are called VABs, okay? Values, attitudes, and beliefs. And as much as I've said that we don't want to do all kinds of cycles together, VABs are done together because they tend to go together, right? Values, attitudes, and beliefs tend to go together. If I value leisure time, then I must have a belief that leisure is good for me, and I must have a positive attitude towards leisure time. So these things tend to cluster. So values, attitudes, and beliefs. Values are just things that we think are valuable, and our attitude is our kind of reaction to something based on how we evaluate it. So if we think about how these things might go together, I might say, I really want my students to think critically. I feel that it's the real purpose of education, but we're not achieving that. You can see our values, attitudes, and beliefs cluster together here. I can name the value, that it is the person values critical thinking. I can name a belief. They believe that we're not achieving critical thinking, right? So that would be the next cycle that we would take the washing machine through. And we do them together because they sort of cluster together. And how you would do this in your right-hand margin, don't just write a V, oh, there's a value, oh, B, there's a belief, but name the value, name the belief. And sometimes if you can identify a value, a belief or an attitude would be implied. It might not be explicitly stated, but it might be quite clear what the implicit belief is. So think about how you might work with those. And remember that you're always going to be memo writing as you go along. So if I take my little chunk of data from our research project, I can identify a value. Spending time with children is valued, right? I was very positive at first. I could spend time with the kids and so on. So clearly this person values spending time with their children. And they have an attitude. The attitude is an appreciative attitude towards having time with children. So in the beginning of being, of working from home, they valued having time with children, they had a positive attitude about it. And then they came to have a belief that the job was starting to expand into their home life and beginning to detract from home life. So values, attitudes, and beliefs, it's often useful to go through all of the data and to look for values, look for attitudes, look for beliefs. Why would I do this? Well, we're trying to get insight into how a human being experiences something about the world through the words that they have told us about that experience. And one of the features of human experience is our values, the things that we think are valuable, our attitudes towards things, our beliefs about things. So instead of just going and just randomly sort of summarizing, it's much more useful to have a much more focused way of coding these experiences. So we are essentially breaking up human experience into these different dimensions, one of those being people's values, another being their attitudes, another being their beliefs. Okay, so moving swiftly along because our time is going, another cycle of the washing machine would be emotion coding, so again, we could take our same little excerpt and we could take it through emotion coding. Now, people sometimes ask me, but is it okay if I've got lots of coding for one sentence or one chunk? Yes, some of the chunks of data will be rich with meaning and they might be full of all kinds of colors. There's a value there, there's an attitude, there's a belief, there's an emotion. So feel free to code and recode. But each of these cycles is revealing more and more dimensions of insight into human experience. So we could take it through emotion coding, and we're not going to psychoanalyze our participants. We're not going to say, oh, I think that they're feeling a bit sad here. That's not our job. We're just coding, and we're staying with what is actually there in the data. And if we read here, we can see that the person was feeling positive at first about being at home, feeling appreciative, then feeling unprepared for the job expanding, feeling unable to switch off, feeling the need to constantly be alert, and so on. So it's really useful to take the whole data set through what we would call emotion coding, looking for the actually expressed emotions that are there in the textual data. Another cycle of the washing machine is what I would call versus coding. And versus coding is useful because one of the ways in which we as human beings understand things is by understanding what is in relation to what is not. In other words, we only have a concept of, say, soft because we have a concept of hard, right? So these things work together. And so versus coding often enables us to gain a new sort of set of insights into a phenomenon, right? The object is to identify conflicts or tensions or oppositions or contrasts. Anywhere in your data, the person is setting up some sort of opposition or contrast, a this versus that. It could be administrator versus teacher. It could be yesterday versus today, before I got my degree versus after, any kind of opposition. So identify all of those across your data can be really important, and not forgetting to write your hunches as you go along. So we can think of positive at first versus less positive later. So that is a versus within this little chunk that the person is kind of transitioning from feeling quite positive about being at home, staying with the kids and all that, and then it becomes less positive experience. Before work happened at work, now work happens constantly. That's a then versus now. Having a clear work-life separation versus no boundaries or unclear boundaries. So I really urge you to look for these in your data in order for the data to be able to expose itself in a new way and expose something different about what's going on beneath the surface. So that would be versus coding. There is also something called magnitude coding, where you assign a sort of frequency or a strongly opposed, strongly in favor, neutral, something like that, some sort of magnitude assessment to the data. It might sound weird in qualitative data, but if you think about it, I could look across a whole interview transcript and I could say to myself, I want to know whether across this interview, the emotions that are being expressed are very positive, very negative, or quite neutral. So that would be magnitude coding. I could code each and every interview for highly positive emotions, highly negative, or quite neutral. Or I could say emotion was very present or hardly expressed or completely absent, right? So it's just something for you to think about. It's just another way of thinking about your data. You could say, if I was looking at people's attitudes towards, I don't know, working from home, then I could say, I'm going to look at and see if this particular interviewee was very positive, very negative, very positive at first, very negative later, or whatever the case might be. So that's just another idea for you. Right, the next cycle in our washing machine would be evaluation coding. So evaluation coding is when people do evaluatory work with the way in which they talk about something. So in a text, whether it's a transcript or whatever, where is the evaluation and what sorts of evaluations are happening? And again, this is because we're trying to get insight into human experience. And one of the things that human beings do is they evaluate their experiences. Was it positive? Was it negative? What was positive or negative about it? Was the other person useful to them, a hindrance, etc., etc.? So constantly, as we move through the world, we are making evaluations in order to make sense of our worlds. And so if you want to gain insight into the life world of a person, it is useful to surface the evaluatory work that they are doing. So evaluation coding looks a bit like this. I could say the manager here was evaluated as decent. My manager is actually a decent person. So that's evaluatory work that is going on here. My manager was evaluated as not unreasonable by their own logic. My manager is evaluated as no longer being able to perceive the boundary between work, and the system was evaluated as assuming constant availability. So you can see that we've already done a lot of coding of this one little chunk of data for our project, but that each time we use a different lens or a different cycle of our washing machine, there's different stuff to be said about it. There's emotion going on, there's this versus that, there's values, attitudes, beliefs, and now we're seeing that there are also evaluations that are going on. So you have to put this particular lens on and specifically look for evaluatory work in order to pick it up. It's not just going to sort of emerge for you osmotically. And then finally, a really useful thing to talk about is process or action coding. So when we talk about process or action coding, we are trying to code observable activity or conceptual action, right? And we do this by coding using gerunds. So gerunds are just ing words, right? So things like holding classes, trying to make sense, initiating programs. So it's a particular verb, and we do this because it is useful to be able to identify a process. Let me show you how that works. And let me say that what you're not doing is you're not just going to go through the transcript and find any place where an ing word was. So leaving my laptop. That's not what I mean. What I mean is you're going to make up a code, but the code that you make up, the little phrase that you make up, must have an ing word in it, right? So let's see how that would be. Not having to commute, being able to spend more time with children, being unprepared for the expansion of the never leaving work, losing work-life separation, physically removing work artifacts, re-establishing rituals, concretely signaling that work is over. Now, why do we call these action or process? Why do we call this cycle of the washing machine action or process coding? If you think about it, it helps us to see how a process unfolds. Look at the gerunds that are assigned here, and you can see the process unfolding. At first, the good stuff, not having to commute, being able to spend more time with children, but then moving in my process towards feeling quite unprepared for this expansion. The fact that I feel like I'm never leaving work. I'm starting to lose my work-life separation. And then I re-establish order by physically removing work artifacts, re-establishing rituals, and finding ways of concretely signaling that work is over. So there's almost like a circular process here of going from positive and it's all grand and cool, and then experiencing this discombobulation and then re-establishing order. So that's why we call it process or action coding, because it helps us to identify processes in the data if we code in this way. And it's very exciting for me to use gerunds to code. So one of the things that I just wanted to say sort of almost in closing is that as you go through all of these cycles, especially if you're working with other people or you see other people's codings, you might notice that some people tend to be lumpers and some people tend to be splitters. And all I mean by that is some people have a tendency to assign lots and lots and lots and lots of codes, and other people have a tendency to assign far fewer codes. Now, there are strengths and weaknesses to both. And the important thing is to just have an awareness of what kind of coder you are, because then you can sort of be watchful for the weaknesses. Obviously, if you're a lumper, the danger is that you lose meaning quickly, or you impose meaning on the data too quickly, and you lose some of what the data was trying to convey to you. And if you're a splitter, the danger is that you never get the big picture, right? So splitters have to move toward lumping at some stage, and lumpers have to be aware that they shouldn't split too early. Now, as I've said, those first cycle coding methods are just some. I've just given you some of the main ones, some of the ones that I find very fruitful. But there's a lot more things that you could do in first cycle coding depending on your research design. So you might be asking me, which particular one should I use for my study? And my advice would be at least the ones that I've gone through, you should be using with any data set if you're trying to gain insight into experience. They're always useful. And then you could use more specific ones. If you're doing, say, a narrative study, you might be looking at the roles people are playing, or the genre that the story is told in. Is told as a comedy? Is it told as a tragedy, or whatever? But you can't know in advance which one is going to be most fruitful. The exact choice would depend on your study. And I would urge you then to take your data systematically through many cycles of the washing machine before you jump to deciding what the themes are, right? And once you have all of those codes, you can begin to move towards second cycle coding, which is when you feel confident that you have rigorously washed those clothes. You've rigorously taken them through many different cycles of the washing machine, and you can now put the data away because you haven't lost any of its essence, and you've got all of your codes which are capturing what is going on in that data, and you can begin to label your codes. Okay. You would gather those codes into a single document and begin to work with them. So second cycle coding, you've got all of these different spare parts, right? All of these codes are just isolated parts. And your job now is to try to build them into something that has meaning, right? To pick up each of those parts and to begin to piece them together. So second cycle coding is about finding the themes or patterns in the data. And really what I find useful is to take a big table and to have all of those codes on pieces of paper and sticky notes and to start to shuffle them around physically and to say, well, these seem to go together and those seem to go together, and to begin to think what the umbrella label will be that you will use to define why those codes belong together. What is the theme, in other words? And as you go through your analysis, remember that you're trying to identify these patterns in the data. You would go from your data to coding, to comparing codes with codes, deciding what goes together, and then arriving at your themes. And what I want to say about those themes is that they are at quite a high level of abstraction, right? So you're taking all of those codes that you think belong together and you're saying, why am I saying that they belong together? What does literature say about this? And what terms can I use from the scholarly literature to come up with a label at quite a high level of abstraction that gives meaning to why all of these codes are speaking together and why they belong together? So your analysis will not just be telling your reader what the codes are and giving examples. Your analysis is definitely not belittling or insulting your participants, saying these participants were silly, they didn't get the memo or whatever. And you're not just going to be repeating words that your participants have already said. What you're doing is you're looking for patterns in the data and taking that code as a step towards analysis. Okay, but we're not going to do theorizing or analysis today. Our webinar was simply about different ways of working with qualitative data.